Virgin man lived 40 years without a woman crossing his door until she begged to stay the night. The thunder rolled across the Colorado plains like God's own warning, and Ezekiel Thornfield knew it meant trouble. He'd lived 30 years in this godforsaken territory, and storms this fierce always brought something unexpected to his doorstep. What he didn't expect was her. The knock came at midnight, desperate and urgent against his weathered oak door. Ezekiel set down his worn Bible and listened. Another knock, weaker this time, followed by what sounded like a woman's sob cutting through the howling wind. He'd never had a woman set foot in his cabin. Not once in all his years of solitary living on the edge of Copper Ridge. The townspeople whispered about the hermit who lived in the mountains, the man who came to town only for supplies and never looked a woman in the eye. They called him strange, cursed, broken. They weren't entirely wrong. The knocking stopped. Ezekiel waited, his calloused hand hovering over the door handle. The storm raged harder, rain hammering against his windows like bullets. Then he heard it, a soft thud against his door, the sound of someone collapsing. His conscience won the battle with his fear. The door swung open to reveal a young woman crumpled on his porch, soaked to the bone and shivering violently. She couldn't have been more than 20, with golden hair plastered to her pale face and a torn blue dress that had seen better days. Blood seeped from a gash on her forehead. "Please," she whispered, her green eyes finding his in the lamplight. "Don't turn me away." Ezekiel stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to close the door and pretend this moment never happened. But the woman's lips were turning blue, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. She was dying. "I won't hurt you," she managed, reading the terror in his dark eyes. "I just need somewhere safe until morning." Safe? The word hit him like a physical blow. Nothing about this was safe, not for her, and certainly not for him. But the alternative was letting her die on his doorstep, and despite everything, Ezekiel Thornfield was still a man with a soul. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, like a broken bird. Her head rolled against his chest as he carried her inside, and he caught the scent of her hair beneath the rain and mud, something sweet and clean that made his heart race in ways he'd forgotten were possible. The cabin felt different with her in it, smaller somehow, as if her presence had shifted the very air. Ezekiel laid her on his simple cot and immediately stepped back, maintaining as much distance as possible while still being able to help. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Cordelia," she whispered, "Cordelia Blackwood." The name sent ice through his veins. Everyone in 3 counties knew about the Blackwoods, the wealthy family that owned half the territory, including the silver mines that kept Copper Ridge alive. They were powerful, connected, and absolutely the last people whose daughters should be bleeding on his floor. "What happened to you, Miss Blackwood?" Cordelia's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away from him. I can't tell you. Not yet. Please, just let me stay until the storm passes." Ezekiel knew he should demand answers. Should march her right back into that storm and let her family deal with whatever trouble she'd brought. But something in her voice, a brokenness that matched his own, kept him rooted in place. "You're hurt," he said instead. "That cut needs tending." He moved to his small wash basin, hands shaking as he prepared clean water and cloth. When was the last time he'd been this close to another person? When was the last time someone had needed him for anything beyond chopping wood or mending fence? "I'll be gentle," he promised, approaching the cot like she was a spooked horse. Cordelia nodded, closing her eyes as he knelt beside her. Her skin was so pale it seemed to glow in the firelight, and Ezekiel had to force himself to focus on the wound and nothing else. His fingers brushed her hairline as he cleaned the cut, and she shivered at his touch. "You have kind hands," she murmured. The comment nearly undid him. Kind. No one had ever called any part of him kind. The people of Copper Ridge saw him as the weird mountain man who lived like a monk and couldn't string 2 sentences together around women. They weren't wrong about the last part. "Why aren't you married?" Cordelia asked suddenly, her green eyes studying his face. Heat flooded Ezekiel's cheeks, and he nearly dropped the cloth. That's not proper talk, miss. Nothing about tonight is proper. She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. A unmarried woman seeking shelter with a bachelor? We'd both be ruined if anyone knew. Then why did you come here? The question hung in the air between them. Cordelia stared at the fire, her jaw set in determination that seemed far too mature for her young face. Because you're the only man in 50 miles who never comes to town looking for a wife. The only one who might help me without expecting ... payment. The implication hit him like a punch to the gut. Whatever had happened to her, whatever she was running from, it involved men who took things that weren't freely given. Rage built in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. Who hurt you? It doesn't matter now. It does to me. The words surprised them both. Cordelia searched his face, seeing something there that made her breath catch. This strange, gentle giant with his too long dark hair and eyes like winter storms. He actually cared. Not about her family's money or her reputation, but about her. My father arranged a marriage, she said finally, to a man 3 times my age who already buried 2 wives. I refused, so he locked me in my room until I came to my senses. Tonight was my only chance to escape. Where will you go? I don't know. Denver, maybe. Or California. Somewhere I can disappear and start over. Ezekiel stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the mountain paths into rivers of mud. No one could travel in this weather, which meant, you can't leave tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either, if this keeps up. Panic flashed across Cordelia's features. I can't stay here. If someone sees me, if word gets back to my father, no one comes up here, ever. But surely you have visitors? Friends? Ezekiel's laugh held no humor. I haven't had a conversation longer than 10 words with another person in months. You're safer here than anywhere else in the territory. The admission hung heavy between them. This man, this kind, damaged man, lived in complete isolation. By choice or circumstance, Cordelia couldn't tell, but the loneliness in his voice was unmistakable. Why? She asked softly. Why what? Why do you live alone? You're not that old, maybe 30. You could have a wife, children. Ezekiel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Some men aren't meant for that life. Says who? Says everyone who's ever met me. The bitterness in his voice made Cordelia's heart ache. She'd spent her life surrounded by people who wanted something from her. Her father's approval, her family's money, her hand in marriage for social advancement. But this man wanted nothing except to be left alone, and somehow that made her want to know everything about him. I don't believe that. You don't know me, Miss Blackwood. Then tell me. Ezekiel turned from the window, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment, Cordelia thought he might actually open up. Then his walls slammed back into place. You should rest. We'll talk about what to do come morning. He moved to the far corner of the cabin, settling into a rickety chair that had seen better decades. The message was clear. She could have the cot, but he would maintain proper distance between them. Always the gentleman, even in his self-imposed exile. But as Cordelia pulled his rough wool blanket up to her chin, she found herself studying his profile in the firelight. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, and those haunted eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. Whatever had driven him to this lonely existence, it had nothing to do with lack of appeal. If anything, his mysterious nature only made him more intriguing. Ezekiel? Yes, miss? Thank you for helping me. For not asking questions I can't answer yet. Everyone deserves a safe place to land when they're falling. The poetry in his words surprised her. This wasn't the simple mountain man the townspeople described. This was someone who understood pain, who spoke in metaphors born from experience. Have you been falling long? She asked. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Ezekiel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Since I was old enough to know I was different. Different how? But he'd already closed his eyes, signaling the end of their conversation. Cordelia respected his boundaries, even as curiosity ate at her. What could make a man so afraid of human connection? What had happened to convince him he was better off alone? The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, an unexpected warmth settled over them both. For the first time in years, Ezekiel wasn't completely alone. And for the first time in her life, Cordelia felt truly safe. Neither of them slept well that night, too aware of the other's presence to find real rest. But as dawn broke gray and cold over the Colorado mountains, something had shifted between them. The careful distance Ezekiel maintained couldn't hide the way his eyes followed her movements, or how Cordelia found excuses to linger near him as he prepared a simple breakfast. The rain stopped, she observed, though her tone held no enthusiasm for the fact. Roads still washed out. Be days before it's safe to travel. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by guilt. She shouldn't want to stay here with this strange, lonely man. Shouldn't feel safer in his one-room cabin than she'd ever felt in her father's mansion. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. The words came out rougher than Ezekiel intended, betraying more emotion than he wanted to show. They ate in comfortable silence, stealing glances at each other across his small wooden table. The morning light revealed details the darkness had hidden, the fine lines around. Ezekiel's eyes that spoke of too much solitude, the determined set of Cordelia's jaw that suggested she was stronger than her delicate appearance implied. What did you do before this? Cordelia gestured around the sparse cabin. Worked my father's ranch, until he died and my brother inherited everything. And then? Then I learned that blood doesn't always mean family. The pain in his voice was so raw it made Cordelia's chest tighten. She recognized the tone, the careful neutrality people used when talking about wounds that never fully healed. I'm sorry, long time ago now. But time, Cordelia was learning, didn't always heal the deepest cuts. Sometimes it just taught you how to live with them. What about you? Ezekiel asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. What's the daughter of the richest family in Colorado doing running away in the middle of the night? Cordelia's fingers traced patterns on the wooden table, her green eyes distant. Being rich doesn't make you free. Sometimes it's just a prettier cage. Your father seems to disagree. My father sees me as a business transaction, a way to merge his mining interests with another family's land holdings. My feelings on the matter are irrelevant. Anger flashed in Ezekiel's dark eyes again, that protective instinct he didn't understand or trust. No woman should be forced into marriage. Tell that to every father in America. She had a point. The frontier might be wild and lawless in some ways, but when it came to women's rights, it was as rigid as anywhere else. Maybe more so. What will you do if they find you? They won't, not here. Cordelia spoke with such certainty that Ezekiel found himself believing her. This mountain had been his sanctuary for 8 years. Maybe it could be hers too, at least for a while. The thought terrified him. I should check the road conditions, he said abruptly, standing so fast his chair scraped against the floor. I'll come with you. No. The word came out sharper than he intended. You should rest. That head injury ... is fine. And I've been cooped up for weeks. Please, I just need some fresh air. Ezekiel wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the barriers that had kept him safe all these years. But something about the way she asked, the quiet desperation in her voice, broke down his defenses. Stay close, he muttered, grabbing his coat. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed fresh by the storm. Cordelia breathed deeply, tilting her face to the weak Colorado sun. Ezekiel watched her from the corner of his eye, struck by how she seemed to glow in the natural light. It's beautiful up here, she said, taking in the pine-covered slopes and distant peaks. Peaceful. Lonely, though. Ezekiel didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. They walked the muddy path in comfortable quiet, and Cordelia marveled at how right this felt. This strange, damaged man with his careful words and haunted eyes, somehow, she felt more herself around him than she ever had in polite society. "The road's completely washed out," Ezekiel observed when they reached the main trail down the mountain. "How long before it's passable?" "Week, maybe longer." Cordelia tried to look disappointed, but relief was winning the battle in her chest. "A week. 7 more days in this peaceful place with this enigmatic man who asked nothing of her except to be safe. I'm sorry to impose on you so long. You're not imposing." The quiet certainty in his voice made her heart skip. When was the last time someone had wanted her company for no other reason than simply having her there? "Ezekiel? Yes? Why did you really let me stay last night? You could have directed me to town or to one of your neighbors." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountain wilderness that had been his only companion for so long. Because when someone's running from something that bad, they deserve a place to catch their breath. "How do you know I was running from something that bad?" "Because nobody walks into a storm like that unless what they're walking away from is worse." The observation hit too close to home. Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes, and she turned away before he could see them. But Ezekiel saw anyway, and something in his chest cracked open. "Hey," he said softly, his rough hand hovering uncertainly near her shoulder. "I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't. It's just, no one's ever understood before. Everyone thinks I should be grateful for my father's plans, that marrying well is the height of female ambition." "What is your ambition?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. What did she want beyond freedom from her father's expectations? "I want to matter, not as someone's daughter or wife, but as myself. I want to do something that makes a difference in the world." Ezekiel found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "That's a worthy ambition? You think so?" "Most people would say it's foolish. Most people are afraid of anyone who wants more than they're supposed to have." They stood there in the mountain silence, two broken people who'd found unexpected understanding in each other. The attraction building between them was undeniable now, crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. "We should head back," Ezekiel said, his voice rough. "Should we?" The question held layers of meaning they both understood. Should they go back to the safe distance he'd maintained? Should they pretend this connection wasn't growing stronger by the hour? Should they ignore the way her green eyes made his pulse race and his carefully constructed walls crumble? "Cordelia, I know, this is dangerous for both of us." But neither of them moved. The mountain morning stretched around them, peaceful and private, and for just a moment they let themselves imagine what it would be like if things were different. If he wasn't a hermit convinced he was unworthy of love, if she wasn't a runaway heiress with a price on her head. "We should go back," Ezekiel repeated, but his feet stayed rooted to the muddy path. "Yes," Cordelia agreed, not moving either. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them taking a step. Close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could count the freckles scattered across his nose from years in the mountain sun. Cordelia. Her name was a prayer on his lips. "I know," she whispered. "I know this is impossible." But impossible didn't stop her from reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. Didn't stop him from leaning into her touch like a starving man offered bread. The moment stretched between them, fragile and perfect and doomed. Then a sound from the valley below shattered the spell, the distant echo of horses on the wind. They sprang apart, the reality of their situation crashing down like an avalanche. If someone was coming up the mountain, if word got out that Cordelia Blackwood had spent the night with the hermit of Copper Ridge— "Inside," Ezekiel said urgently. "Now." They rushed back to the cabin, Ezekiel's mind racing with possibilities. The sound could be anyone, trappers, prospectors, or worse, Cordelia's family searching for their missing daughter. His sanctuary, his 8 years of careful isolation, might be shattered in moments. "Get away from the windows," he instructed, pulling heavy curtains across the glass. "If someone's looking for you, they are." Cordelia's voice was small, frightened. "My father won't let me go easily. Too much money at stake." The sound of hooves grew closer, accompanied now by men's voices carrying on the mountain air. Ezekiel pressed his ear to the door, trying to make out words. Tracks led this way. Storm could have washed them out. Check every cabin, every cave. Cordelia went pale. "That's Deputy Morrison's voice. He works for my father." Ezekiel's jaw tightened. He'd tangled with Morrison before. The man was more hired gun than lawman, willing to bend any rule for the right price. If he was leading the search, they weren't planning to take no for an answer. "Is there anywhere to hide?" Cordelia whispered. The cabin was small, sparse. No cellar, no hidden rooms. Just 4 walls and nowhere to disappear. Ezekiel's mind worked frantically, weighing options that all seemed to end in disaster. "The loft," he said finally. "It's not much, but if you stay quiet. He helped her climb the narrow ladder to the small space under the eaves where he stored his few belongings. It was cramped, barely large enough for one person, but it was out of sight from below. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "don't come down until I tell you it's safe." "What if they hurt you?" The concern in her voice caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had worried about his welfare? "They won't. I'm not worth the trouble." But even as he said it, Ezekiel knew that might not be true anymore. Harboring a runaway heiress changed everything. Made him a target instead of just an oddity to be ignored. The horses were almost at his door now. 3 riders, maybe 4, from the sound of it. Ezekiel checked to make sure Cordelia was completely hidden, then forced himself to appear calm as the inevitable knock came. He opened the door to find Deputy Morrison flanked by 2 men he didn't recognize. Hired muscle, by the look of them, with cold eyes and hands that stayed close to their weapons. Thornfield. Morrison touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Mind if we come in?" "I do, actually. What's this about?" "Missing person. Young lady from a prominent family." Morrison's pale eyes swept over Ezekiel's shoulder, trying to peer into the cabin. "Disappeared 2 nights ago during that storm. Haven't seen anyone." "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough." It wasn't really a request. Morrison was already pushing past him into the small space, his hired guns following. Ezekiel's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain still. Any resistance would only make them more suspicious. "Cozy place you got here," Morrison observed, his tone mocking. "Must get lonely, all by yourself. I like the quiet. Bet you do." Morrison opened the chest where Ezekiel kept his few possessions, tossing clothes and books aside with deliberate carelessness. Funny thing about quiet places, they echo real well. Sound carries. Ezekiel's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. Above them, he prayed Cordelia was staying perfectly still. One of Morrison's men was examining the fireplace, noting the ashes were still warm. "Someone's been cooking recently. More than usual, looks like." "I eat." "Sure you do. But seems like you've been eating for 2. The observation was too close to the truth. Ezekiel had prepared larger portions that morning without thinking, his instincts already adjusting to having someone else to care for. "You calling me a liar, deputy?" Morrison smiled, the expression cold and predatory. "Just making observations. Like how there's 2 cups on your table there." Ezekiel's blood turned to ice. In their rush to get inside, he hadn't thought to clear away the evidence of Cordelia's presence. The second cup sat there like an accusation, impossible to explain away. "Sometimes I drink coffee, sometimes tea, at the same time." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implied threat. Morrison's hand rested casually on his gun butt, and his companions had positioned themselves to block the door. If this went bad, Ezekiel was trapped. "Look, Thornfield, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." Miss Blackwood's father is real anxious to get her back. Real generous with his gratitude, too, if you catch my meaning. Don't know any Miss Blackwood? No? Pretty little blonde thing, about 20 years old? Green eyes that'd make a preacher sin? Morrison's description was deliberately crude, designed to provoke a reaction. Word is she might have sought shelter somewhere during that storm. Somewhere private, where a man might get ideas above his station. The implication hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. Morrison was suggesting he'd compromised Cordelia, damaged her reputation for his own gain. The accusation was so far from the truth, it was almost laughable. Except there was nothing funny about the way the deputy's hand tightened on his weapon. I told you, I haven't seen anyone. Then you won't mind if we check your loft. Ezekiel's world tilted. Above them, he heard the faintest creak of floorboards as Cordelia shifted position. Morrison heard it too, his pale eyes lighting up with satisfaction. Well now, what do we have here? One of the hired guns was already moving toward the ladder, his scarred face twisted in a predatory grin. In seconds he'd find Cordelia, and then... Ezekiel didn't let himself finish the thought. He moved without conscious decision, his fist connecting with the man's jaw before anyone could react. The hired gun dropped like a stone, unconscious before he hit the floor. That was stupid, Morrison said, drawing his gun with practiced ease. Real stupid. Maybe. But I'm done pretending to be polite. The transformation in Ezekiel was startling. Gone was the awkward hermit, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. Morrison's remaining companions suddenly looked less certain about their odds. You're harboring a fugitive, Thornfield. That's a serious crime. Funny. I thought forcing women into unwanted marriages was the crime. Marriage is a family matter, none of your concern. It is when she comes to me for help. The admission hung in the air between them. Morrison smiled, victory gleaming in his cold eyes. So you admit she's here. Too late, Ezekiel realized his mistake. In his anger, he'd revealed exactly what Morrison had been fishing for. The deputy now had confirmation that Cordelia was in the cabin and legal justification for whatever came next. Doesn't matter, Ezekiel said quietly. You're not taking her. You prepared to die for some rich girl's tantrum? If that's what it takes. Morrison laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You really think she cares about you? About this? He gestured around the sparse cabin with obvious disdain. Soon as Daddy forgives her little rebellion, she'll be back in her fancy house with her fancy dresses, and you'll just be embarrassing memories she tries to forget. The words cut deep because part of Ezekiel feared they might be true. What could someone like Cordelia Blackwood possibly see in a broken hermit who'd been hiding from the world for 8 years? When this was over, when she was safe, wouldn't she naturally return to the life she'd always known? Maybe, he said. But right now, she needs protection. And I'm the only one offering it without strings attached. Noble, stupid, but noble. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger. Last chance, Thornfield. Send her down and we'll let you live. No. The word rang with quiet finality. Whatever happened next, Ezekiel had made his choice. He'd spent 8 years running from connection, from responsibility, from the possibility of loss. But some things were worth fighting for, even if you lost. Especially if you lost. Morrison raised his gun, and time seemed to slow. Ezekiel could see the deputy's finger beginning to squeeze. Could imagine the bullet that would end his pathetic excuse for a life. At least it would mean something. At least he'd finally stood up for someone who mattered. The shot never came. Instead, a voice from above froze everyone in place. Stop. Cordelia appeared at the top of the ladder, her golden hair catching the light streaming through the windows. Even disheveled from hiding, she looked every inch the aristocrat she'd been born to be. Morrison's gun wavered as he took in her appearance. Miss Blackwood, your father's been worried sick. I'm sure he has. Cordelia's voice dripped with sarcasm as she climbed down the ladder with careful dignity. Worried about his business deal, you mean? Now that's not fair. He loves you. He loves what I represent. There's a difference." Cordelia moved to stand beside Ezekiel, her small hand finding his larger one. The gesture was deliberate, defiant, and it sent Morrison's eyebrows shooting toward his hairline. "You can tell my father I'm safe and well, and that I won't be coming home to marry the ancient relic he's chosen for me. Miss, you're upset, not thinking clearly. Once you're home, I'll be locked in my room until I agree to his terms. No, deputy, I'm not going anywhere." Morrison's face hardened. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice. Your father has legal guardianship until you're 21, and if I refuse, then we take you by force, and your friend here gets arrested for kidnapping." The threat was clear. Cordelia could come willingly, or Ezekiel would pay the price for her defiance. It was exactly the kind of manipulation her father excelled at, offering choices that weren't really choices at all. "You bastard," she whispered. "Just doing my job, miss." Cordelia looked at Ezekiel, seeing the resignation already forming in his dark eyes. He was going to let them take her rather than see her suffer for his sake. The realization broke something loose in her chest, a fierce protectiveness she'd never felt before. "There's another option," she said quietly. "What's that?" "I could marry someone else. Tonight. Then my father's guardianship would transfer to my husband, and his business arrangement would be void." Morrison laughed. "Who exactly did you have in mind? Your mountain man here. He's got no money, no position, no prospects. Your father would have the marriage annulled before the ink dried on the certificate. He would try. But if the marriage were consummated ... double quotes, the word hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Morrison's laughter died abruptly as he grasped the implications. A consummated marriage couldn't be easily dissolved, especially with witnesses to testify to its legitimacy. You wouldn't. I would, to protect him and to secure my own freedom. Ezekiel stared at her in shock. Marriage. The one thing he'd never allowed himself to imagine, never believed he could have or deserve. And she was offering it to him, not out of love, but as a strategic move in a complex game. It should have hurt, should have felt like the ultimate rejection. Instead, all he could think about was how brave she was, how willing to sacrifice her own happiness to protect his. "Cordelia, no, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She turned to face him fully, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Unless you don't want to marry me." The question was asked lightly, but Ezekiel could see the vulnerability beneath her brave facade. She was taking an enormous risk, proposing to a man she'd known for less than 2 days. A man who might reject her offer and leave her with no options at all. "It's not about wanting," he said softly. "It's about what you deserve. What I deserve is the right to choose my own future. And I choose you." The words hit him like lightning. Choose you. When had anyone ever chosen him for anything? His brother had chosen the ranch and left Ezekiel with nothing. His parents had chosen to believe the worst about him rather than defend their younger son. The people of Copper Ridge had chosen to see him as a curiosity rather than a man worthy of respect. But this extraordinary woman, this force of nature who could have had anyone, was choosing him. "The preacher in town won't marry you without your father's consent," Morrison pointed out, grasping at straws. "Then we'll find one who will. Or we'll drive to the next county, the next territory if we have to. You're talking about running away again. You think you can hide forever?" "I think I can hide long enough to make it legal and binding." Morrison's remaining companion stirred uncomfortably. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. Chasing runaway heiresses was one thing, but interfering with a legitimate marriage was something else entirely. "Sir," the man said quietly, "maybe we should talk to her father before we do anything ... permanent." Morrison's jaw worked furiously. He'd been so close to collecting the substantial reward Blackwood had offered for his daughter's return. Now she was slipping through his fingers again, and there wasn't much he could do about it legally. "This is crazy," he said finally. "You think marrying some hermit mountain man is going to solve your problems? I think it's going to create new problems, better problems, problems I choose for myself. Cordelia squeezed Ezekiel's hand, drawing strength from his solid presence beside her. She meant every word. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she'd rather face them with this kind, damaged man than submit to a life of gilded captivity. "What do you say?" she asked Ezekiel quietly. "Will you marry me?" The question was simple. The answer was anything but. Marriage meant responsibility, commitment, the end of his carefully maintained isolation. It meant trusting someone with his heart, his secrets, his broken places. It meant risking everything he'd spent 8 years protecting. It also meant waking up every morning to those green eyes, falling asleep every night to the sound of her breathing. It meant having someone who chose him, who saw something in him worth fighting for. "Yes," he said, the word rough with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Morrison swore viciously, but he was out of legal options. He couldn't arrest them for planning a marriage, couldn't drag Cordelia home against her will if she was about to become another man's wife. "Your father's going to make your lives hell," he warned. "Let him try," Cordelia said with quiet confidence. "He'll find I'm not as helpless as he thinks." The deputy holstered his gun with obvious reluctance. "This isn't over." "Yes," Ezekiel said firmly, "it is." Morrison and his remaining companion departed with threats and dark promises, but they departed nonetheless. Ezekiel and Cordelia stood in the sudden silence of the cabin, the magnitude of what they just committed to settling over them like snow. "Are we insane?" Cordelia asked finally. "Probably." "Do you regret it?" Ezekiel looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the way she'd stood beside him against armed men, the courage it had taken to propose a solution that saved them both. "No," he said quietly. "I don't regret it," and surprisingly, he meant it. The silence that followed Morrison's departure felt different from the peaceful quiet Ezekiel had known for 8 years. This silence hummed with possibility, with fear, with the weight of promises made in desperation that somehow felt more real than anything he'd ever experienced. Cordelia moved to the window, watching the dust cloud of the departing riders fade into the distance. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the curtain back into place, the reality of what they'd just committed to settling over her like a heavy cloak. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "With more men, maybe with my father himself. How long do we have? A day, maybe 2. Depends how fast Morrison rides and how quickly my father can mobilize his resources." Ezekiel nodded grimly. Augustus Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in 3 territories, with connections that reached all the way to Washington. When he wanted something done, it got done quickly and thoroughly. "We need to get married before they return," Cordelia continued. "Actually married legally and bindingly, or all of this was for nothing." The practicality of her words couldn't hide the uncertainty in her voice. They were strangers planning to bind their lives together based on 2 days of acquaintance and a shared moment of desperation. The rational part of Ezekiel's mind screamed that this was madness. The rest of him had never felt more certain of anything in his life. "The nearest preacher is in Copper Ridge," he said, "but word travels fast in small towns. If we show up asking to be married ... everyone will know within the hour, including Morrison, if he's still in the area." They stood on opposite sides of the small cabin, the distance between them feeling vast despite the confined space. The easy intimacy they'd shared that morning was gone, replaced by the awkward awareness of 2 people who just agreed to something that would change everything. "There's another option," Ezekiel said slowly. "Old Pete Garrison up in Silver Creek. He's a retired circuit preacher, still licensed to perform marriages. Keeps to himself, doesn't ask many questions." "How far?" "Hard ride through the mountains, 6 hours, maybe 7. Cordelia bit her lip, calculating risks and timing. "If we left now, we'd be back by midnight, married." The word felt strange on his tongue, foreign and thrilling and terrifying all at once. And if Morrison comes back before we return, he'll find an empty cabin and cold ashes. No way to know where we've gone. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the best they had." Cordelia nodded decisively, that determined look settling over her features again. "Then we go now." They moved with efficient purpose, gathering supplies for the journey. Ezekiel saddled his 2 horses, an old gelding named Buck that he used for supply runs, and a younger mare called Sage that he'd been training. Neither was built for speed, but they were sure-footed on mountain trails and had the stamina for a long day's ride. Watching Cordelia prepare for the journey, Ezekiel was struck by how naturally she adapted to circumstances. Gone was any trace of the pampered heiress, replaced by a woman who checked her own saddle straps and secured her supplies with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before," he observed. "My father believed in practical education. Said a Blackwood should be able to survive in any environment." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "I don't think this is what he had in mind." They rode out as the sun reached its zenith, following deer trails and logging roads that wound through the Colorado high country. The landscape was breathtaking. Pine forests giving way to aspen groves, their leaves shimmering gold in the autumn light, then opening onto high meadows dotted with wildflowers that would soon succumb to winter's approach. For the first hour, they rode in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. The magnitude of their decision seemed to grow with every mile, the weight of it settling between them like an invisible passenger. "Tell me about your brother," Cordelia said finally, needing to fill the silence with something other than her own spiraling thoughts. Ezekiel's hands tightened on his reins. "Why?" "Because in a few hours we're going to be married. And I know almost nothing about the man I'm marrying, beyond the fact that he's kind enough to take in strangers and brave enough to stand up to armed men." The observation was fair, if uncomfortable. If they were going to bind their lives together, she deserved to know what she was getting into. His name was Jacob, 3 years older, everything my father wanted in a son. Was? He died 2 winters ago, pneumonia. Cordelia heard the pain in his voice, but also something else, guilt, perhaps, or unresolved anger. "I'm sorry." "Are you? Even knowing that his death is the only reason I have anything to offer you?" The bitterness in his tone made her pull her horse closer to his. "What do you mean?" Ezekiel was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible over the sound of hooves on stone. "When our father died, Jacob inherited everything. The ranch, the cattle, the land. Everything our family had built over 2 generations. I got a horse and a $20 gold piece. That seems unfair. Jacob thought so too. Offered to split everything with me, make me a full partner." Ezekiel's laugh held no humor. "I was too proud to accept charity from my older brother, too stubborn to admit I needed help. So I left instead, and now you regret it. Now he's dead, and I'm the sole heir to a ranch I walked away from out of stupid pride. Property I never wanted, money I never earned, all because I was too much of a fool to accept love when it was offered freely." The pieces clicked into place for Cordelia. The self-imposed isolation, the conviction that he was unworthy of companionship, it all stemmed from guilt over his brother's death and his own perceived failures. "You think Jacob's death was your fault somehow. If I'd stayed, if I'd been there to help with the work, maybe he wouldn't have pushed himself so hard. Maybe he wouldn't have gotten sick. Or maybe you would have gotten sick too and died with him. Maybe your leaving meant he lived longer than he would have otherwise, knowing someone would carry on the family name." Ezekiel looked at her sharply. "That's not how it works, isn't it? You don't know what would have happened if you'd made different choices. None of us do. But punishing yourself for decisions you made in good faith doesn't honor his memory." Her words hit him like physical blows, cutting through years of self-recrimination and carefully maintained guilt. When had he started believing that suffering was the only appropriate response to loss? When had isolation become his penance for the crime of outliving his brother? Jacob sounds like he was a good man, Cordelia continued gently. The kind of man who would want his brother to be happy, to build a life worth living. Do you really think he'd want you hiding in the mountains, convinced you don't deserve love? I don't know what I deserve. Then let me tell you, you deserve someone who sees your worth, someone who chooses you not out of desperation, but because you're worth choosing. The words hung between them, honest and raw and more intimate than any physical touch. Ezekiel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten they weren't permanent. Is that what you're doing? He asked quietly. Choosing me? Cordelia guided her horse around a fallen log, using the moment to gather her thoughts. The honest answer was complicated, layered with practical necessity and growing emotional attachment she didn't fully understand. I was running when I came to your door, she said finally. Running from a life I didn't want, from people who saw me as property to be traded. But staying ... Choosing you. That's not about running anymore. What is it about? It's about finding someone who sees me as a person, not a possession. Someone who asks what I want instead of telling me what I need. Someone who stands up for what's right, even when it costs him everything. They crested a ridge, and the valley of Silver Creek spread out below them. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and they could hear the distant sound of hammers and saws as the small mining community went about its daily business. Are you sure about this? Ezekiel asked, his voice thick with emotion. Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm sure. Cordelia's voice was steady, certain. Are you? Ezekiel looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the determined set of her shoulders. The way she sat her horse like she was born to it, the courage that had brought her this far and kept her fighting when most people would have given up. Yes, he said. I'm sure. They rode into Silver Creek as the afternoon sun painted the mountains gold and crimson. The town was smaller than Copper Ridge, rougher around the edges, with the temporary feel of a place where people came to make their fortune and leave. Perfect for their purposes. No one here knew or cared about the Blackwood family politics. Pete Garrison's cabin sat on the outskirts of town, a neat little structure with a well-tended garden and smoke curling from the chimney. The old preacher himself was chopping wood when they rode up, his weathered face breaking into a smile of genuine pleasure at the sight of visitors. Ezekiel Thornfield, haven't seen you in a dog's age. What brings you down from your mountain? Afternoon, Pete. Ezekiel dismounted, helping Cordelia down from her horse. We need to ask a favor. I figured as much. Don't get many social calls up here. Pete's keen eyes took in Cordelia's appearance, noting the quality of her clothes despite their current state of disrepair. And who might this lovely lady be? Cordelia Blackwood, she said, extending her hand with natural grace. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Garrison. Pete's eyebrows shot up at the name, but he shook her hand without comment. Whatever he thought about the daughter of Augustus Blackwood showing up at his door with a hermit of Copper Ridge, he kept it to himself. What kind of favor are we talking about? He asked instead. We want to get married, Ezekiel said simply. Tonight? Tonight? Pete set down his axe, studying their faces with the perceptive gaze of a man who'd spent decades reading human nature. That's mighty sudden. You two been courting long? Not exactly, Cordelia admitted. It's complicated. I'll bet it is. Pete rubbed his grizzled chin thoughtfully. You running from something, miss? Someone. My father arranged a marriage I don't want. Ezekiel offered to help. And marriage is the help you settled on? It's the only thing that will make it legally binding. The only way to ensure my father can't force me into another arrangement. Pete nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of life to understand that sometimes people made desperate choices, and it wasn't his place to judge whether they were right or wrong. You both understand what you're getting into? Marriage isn't just a legal contract. It's a sacred bond meant to last until death parts you. We understand, Ezekiel said quietly. Do you? Because I've seen plenty of marriages that started for practical reasons and ended. In heartbreak, when the practical reasons went away, Cordelia felt heat rise in her cheeks. The old preacher was asking the question she'd been trying not to think about. What happened when the immediate crisis was over? When her father's threats were neutralized and she was safe? Would this marriage of convenience become a prison of its own? "We'll make it work," she said with more confidence than she felt. "Will you?" What happens when the honeymoon period wears off and you realize you're bound to a stranger? What happens when Miss Cordelia here gets tired of mountain living and wants to return to civilization? What happens when you, Ezekiel, decide this brave young woman deserves better than a hermit who's been hiding from the world for 8 years? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Pete wasn't trying to be cruel. He was doing what any responsible minister would do, making sure they understood the full implications of their choice. "I can't answer those questions," Ezekiel said finally. "Neither of us can. But I can promise that I'll do everything in my power to be the husband she deserves. And if that's not enough, well, at least she'll be free to make that choice herself. And you, miss? What can you promise?" Cordelia looked at Ezekiel, seeing the vulnerability he was trying to hide behind stoic acceptance. This man who expected so little from life, who'd convinced himself he wasn't worthy of love. He was offering her everything he had, expecting nothing in return except the chance to protect her freedom. "I can promise that I'll try to be worthy of his sacrifice," she said softly, "and that I'll never take for granted what he's offering me." Pete studied them both for a long moment, weighing their words against the desperate circumstances that had brought them here. Finally, he nodded. "All right then. If you're both certain, I'll perform the ceremony. But we do this proper. Vows that mean something, rings if you have them, witnesses to make it legal." "We don't have rings," Cordelia said, suddenly realizing how unprepared they were for the practicalities of marriage. "I do." Ezekiel reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple gold band that caught the fading light. "It was my mother's wedding ring. My father gave it to me before he died, said it should go to the woman I married." The ring was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by decades of wear. Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined Ezekiel carrying it all these years, never expecting to have occasion to use it. "It's perfect," she whispered. "What about a ring for the groom?" Pete asked. Cordelia looked down at her hands, bare of jewelry except for a small signet ring her grandmother had given her. It wasn't traditionally masculine, but it was all she had to offer. Would this work? She slipped off the ring, holding it out to Ezekiel. The gold band was delicate, engraved with her family crest, obviously expensive and feminine. Any other man might have balked at wearing something so clearly designed for a woman. But Ezekiel took it without hesitation, sliding it onto his finger where it fit perfectly. "It's beautiful," he said simply. Pete disappeared into his cabin, returning with a worn Bible and 2 neighbors he'd pressed into service as witnesses. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they gathered in Pete's small garden for the ceremony that would change everything. "Dearly beloved," Pete began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent joining lives together, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to unite this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over them, but Cordelia found herself focusing on Ezekiel's face instead of the preacher's voice. In the golden light of sunset, he looked younger somehow, the hard lines around his eyes softened by something she was afraid to name. Hope, maybe, or possibility. "Marriage is not to be entered into lightly," Pete continued, "but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Lightly." The word echoed in Cordelia's mind. Nothing about this felt light. It felt momentous, weighted with significance that had nothing to do with legal convenience and everything to do with the way. Ezekiel was looking at her. "Do you, Ezekiel Thornfield, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," The words came out rough with emotion, but absolutely certain. "Do you, Cordelia Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part." This was it. The moment when everything changed, when she committed to a future she couldn't predict with a man she barely knew. The practical voice in her head whispered that this was madness, that she was throwing away everything she'd ever known for a stranger's protection. But looking into Ezekiel's dark eyes, seeing the quiet strength and unexpected tenderness there, the voice of doubt faded to nothing. "I do," she said clearly. "The rings, if you please." Ezekiel's hands shook slightly as he slipped his mother's ring onto Cordelia's finger. The gold was warm from his pocket, and it fit as if it had been made for her. "With this ring," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thee wed." Cordelia's own hands were steadier as she placed her grandmother's ring on his finger, the feminine band looking oddly right on his strong hand. "With this ring, I thee wed. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," Pete intoned solemnly, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The moment stretched between them, heavy with significance. Their first kiss would seal not just the marriage ceremony, but the beginning of whatever came next. Ezekiel stepped closer, his large hands gentle as they cupped her face. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly, speaking only to her. "I'm ready," she whispered back. Their lips met in a kiss that was soft, tentative, and somehow more binding than all the words they'd just spoken. It tasted of new beginnings and desperate hope, of two broken people finding unexpected wholeness in each other. When they parted, both were breathing hard, and the witnesses were grinning broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pete announced with obvious satisfaction, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Ezekiel Thornfield, husband and wife." The words rolled through Cordelia's mind like music, strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. She was married to a man she'd known for 3 days in a ceremony performed by candlelight in a stranger's garden, wearing a torn dress and her grandmother's ring. It was perfect. They accepted congratulations from Pete and the witnesses, shared a simple meal by lamplight, and prepared for the long ride back to Ezekiel's cabin. Their cabin now, Cordelia realized with a flutter of something that might have been excitement or terror. "You sure you want to ride back tonight?" Pete asked as they prepared to leave. "You're welcome to stay here, start fresh in the morning." Ezekiel and Cordelia exchanged a look, both thinking of Morrison and the men who would surely return to the mountain. Their wedding had bought them legal protection, but only if they could get back to establish their claim before their enemies regrouped. "Thank you, but we need to get home," Cordelia said, the word feeling foreign and right all at once. Home. When had she started thinking of Ezekiel's isolated cabin as home? The ride back was quieter than their journey out, both of them lost in thought as their horses picked their way carefully along the moonlit trails. The reality of what they'd done was settling over them like fog, bringing with it all the questions they'd been avoiding. "Do you regret it?" Cordelia asked when they were halfway back, the question pulled from her by the silence and the uncertainty. "No," Ezekiel said without hesitation. "Do you?" "No, but I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of disappointing you. Of not being what you need. Of waking up tomorrow and realizing we've made a terrible mistake." Ezekiel pulled his horse to a stop, waiting for her to do the same. In the silver moonlight, her face was pale and beautiful and utterly honest. "Cordelia, may I call you that now?" "You'd better. We're married." A smile tugged at his lips. "Cordelia, then. You could never disappoint me. The fact that you chose to marry me, that you trusted me enough to bind your life to mine, that's more than I ever dreamed I'd have. But what if, no what ifs? We made our choice, and we'll face whatever comes together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Partners in everything, good and bad." She searched his face in the moonlight, seeing sincerity in every line. This man who'd spent 8 years convinced he wasn't worth loving was offering her unconditional acceptance. Partnership without conditions or expectations beyond mutual respect. Partners, she repeated, testing the word. Partners, he confirmed. They reached the cabin just after midnight to find it exactly as they'd left it, cold and empty, with no sign of unwelcome visitors. But something had changed in the hours they'd been gone. The space that had felt like refuge now felt like possibility. Ezekiel built up the fire while Cordelia put away their travel supplies, both of them moving with the awkward awareness of newlyweds unsure of what came next. The cabin seemed smaller somehow, the single cot more obvious, the intimacy of shared space more pronounced. "I can sleep on the floor," Ezekiel said quickly when the silence stretched too long. "Give you privacy." Cordelia turned from where she was hanging up her coat, studying his face. "Is that what you want?" The question was loaded with implications they both understood. Their marriage might have started as a practical arrangement, but the attraction between them was real and growing stronger by the hour. What happened next would determine whether this was a true marriage or simply a legal fiction. "What I want," Ezekiel said carefully, "is whatever makes you comfortable." "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it held answers to impossible questions. "What I want," he said finally, "is to be a real husband to you. Not just in name, but in every way that matters. But only if that's what you want too." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest and charged with possibility. Cordelia felt her heart racing, not with fear, but with anticipation. "It is," she said simply. "What I want, I mean." The space between them seemed to contract, drawing them together like gravity. When Ezekiel reached for her, she came willingly into his arms, their second kiss deeper and more confident than their first. "Are you sure?" he murmured against her lips. "I'm sure," and she was. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges they'd face as husband and wife, tonight was theirs. Tonight, they would make this marriage real in every sense that mattered. Later, much later, as they lay tangled together in the narrow cot, Cordelia traced patterns on Ezekiel's chest and marveled at how right this felt. The man she'd married was gentle and patient, passionate and reverent, everything she'd hoped for and more. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his fingers combing through her golden hair. "None," she said honestly. "You?" "Only that I waited so long to live." Outside, the Colorado wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. Inside the small cabin, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances held each other close and dreamed of futures they'd never dared imagine. Tomorrow would bring challenges, Morrison's return, her father's wrath, the practical realities of building a life together. But tonight, they were simply Ezekiel and Cordelia Thornfield, husband and wife, partners in everything. And that was enough.